this video, I'm going to show you how to use the older technology, ADO.NET 2.0, to connect to both a SQL Server Compact Edition database, and then in a second video, almost identical, we're going to use the same ADO.NET 2.0 to connect to a SQL Server Express Edition database. Now, I'm not doing this because I want you to use this code. Again, my emphasis here is not on the older technology. As I said earlier, I think it's important that you know ADO.NET 2.0, you know that it exists and that there's a lot of legacy code written using ADO.NET. And I think you should know what it is, but I don't think that this is what you want to use going forward. So just watch the overall steps and familiarize yourself in general with the major objects and the approaches of ADO.NET. But at this point, I'm not sure that you need to memorize any of this. And by no means is this video intended to be a comprehensive explanation of ADO.NET. We have other videos, like we said in the previous video, in our archives that are for that purpose if the need should ever arise. All right, so we're going to take this in two passes for this first approach. Again, we're going to use what is called a connected scenario, which means this. We're going to connect to the database and stay connected while we're working and looping through data. And then once we're done working with the data, we're going to disconnect. And so this is called connected mode, and we're going to use an ADO.NET data reader object to accomplish this. 2 videos from now, we're going to take a look at a disconnected scenario, and then you can compare and contrast in your mind what the difference is between the two. Okay, so here's the game plan. First of all, I'm going to create a new project. Then I'm going to, for this first video, I'm going to add a compact edition database, and the next one we'll do the same steps, except we'll do it with a Express Edition database. Then I'm going to write a small console window application that displays data that's retrieved from the compact edition database. And so then in the next video, I'm going to do the same exercise a second time, except with the Express Edition database, and that'll show that the same basic steps exist. The syntax changes up just a little bit, a few nuances as well. In both cases, as I mentioned previously, I'm using a connected approach, which is one of 2 approaches that were made possible with ADO.NET 2.0. In the next video, or I'm sorry, in the next approach, a couple videos from now, we're going to look at the disconnected scenario. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. First thing I'm going to do is create a new project. So File, New Project. I'm going to create a C# console application and call this ADONET 2 connected, and we'll go ahead and call this compact. Okay, kind of strange name, but hopefully that'll describe exactly what it is that we're trying to do here. So the first order of business is that I want to add a new database object to our application. So I right-clicked on the project in the Solution Explorer, which brought up the context menu. I selected Add and just hovered over until I get to the new item, which pops open the new item dialog, and I'll scroll down till I get to a local database. If you recall, 2 videos ago, we talked about the difference between the local and the service-based database. So this is our SQL Server Compact Edition database. Click Add. Okay, and so for right now, what we're going to do is just cancel this Data Source Configuration Wizard dialog. We're not going to use that just yet. But as you can see, I have a new little cylinder which represents a database file. It's called database1.sdf. I could probably rename this if I wanted to by right-clicking and select Rename, but I'm not going to do that. I am, however, going to double-click it, and you can see it brings it open in our Database Explorer. And right now, if I expand the Tables folder, there are no tables, so I'm going to right-click and select Create Table. And I'm going to do something pretty simple here. I'm just going to create a single table called Customers, and it'll have a customer ID, first name, last name, city, and state, and that's it. Okay, so let's start by naming our table Customers, and we'll start off with a customer ID. We'll make that an integer. We'll also make that an identity column, and we're going to make that a primary key, and we're going to make this unique. All right, first name, and we'll make that an nvarchar 100. That looks great. And then we'll do the same for last name. We'll just accept the defaults on that as well. And city will accept the defaults, and state will accept the defaults. We're easy here for this particular example. No need to get too particular about things. Okay, and that should allow us to create that. Great. Now what I want to do is I want to select show table data. So I right clicked on customer and select show table data, which gives us this editor view. So I'm going to start out with Bob Tabor and in Dallas, Texas. And I'm going to give a shout out to my best friend growing up, who is also a .NET developer, who saw my videos on Microsoft and we connected. That was kind of cool. Hey, Steve Jaworski, and he lives in or near Chicago, Illinois. Great. So now I have a database with 2 rows of data. So the next step for me is to determine how I'm going to connect up to a compact edition database from within my .NET app. So to do this, I need a special DLL, a special assembly that allows me to open up that file and work with it. And the .NET Framework has such an assembly available to us. What I'm going to do is right-click on References and select Add Reference. And I don't think I've demonstrated this before, but this allows you to pull in an assembly that isn't normally part or is an extended part of the .NET Framework. So the thought process is this: if you took every one of the 20,000 or more classes in the .NET Framework and you put them in one big honkin' assembly, well, that would be a very large dependent file that you'd have to distribute with your application. But if you were to take some of the core elements and put them into every application that's created, so just the basic stuff, right? Collections, and you can see here anything in like this system.link, and so if you can put some of those into one assembly, but then put all the specialized classes into their own assemblies, you would only pull those in as you need them, and that would reduce the amount of the size of the installation for your application as you go to put it on other people's computers. So that's the thought process of packaging your classes into assemblies. We haven't really talked about that. It's a bigger topic. Let's save that for now, but in general, that's what's going on here, and that's why we need to add a reference. We need to find the assembly that holds the code we need so we can work with compact edition databases like our database1.sdf right here. All right, so we're going to pop over here to .NET, and I'm going to scroll down, and this can sometimes be a little bit tricky to find. I'm going to look in system.data, and I'm looking for something called SQL Server CE. And I may have to look for a while for this. In fact, I might even pause the recording to go search for this on my hard drive. Well, I got lucky right here. I think this is exactly what I wanted. System.data.sqlserver.ce. Okay, if you're not able to find it in this list, and it's not, you may have to actually sort, by clicking the top column here. You may want to go to your browse and then look around your hard drive, or even use the search functionality within Windows to find this file. System.data.sqlserverce.dll is the name of the file. Let's click OK. And so now we can see in our list of references, there are a bunch of references already there. Visual Studio creates those for you as you create a new project. Okay, so what we did was just add one additional reference to an assembly called system.data.sqlserverce. Also, what we're going to do, you remember our using statement here and why we would actually want to use that? So we don't have to type that out every time we want to use this DLL. Okay, so now let's start off with writing a little code. The first thing we need to do is make a handshake. So how are we going to do that? We're going to create what's called a connection object, specifically a SQL CE connection. We're going to call this my connection. So that's our name for it. Equals new SQL CE connection. Okay. And what it wants here, or what I have the option of doing, is passing in, as you can see here, a connection string. What is a connection string? It is a literal string that contains the details of the location and any additional metadata like login information that are required to access our database. So in this case, we'll start with a literal string here, and this is what gets a lot of people tripped up when they first start working with databases. What's the right connection string? I see more posts on more forums that are resolved by correcting the connection string than any other cause for .NET developers. So that's something that we'll want to focus on, is learning the right syntax, or at least knowing where to look, more importantly, for the connection string. And it can change on a per hosting company basis, on a per application basis, on a per database vendor basis. Very complicated. There are some basic steps, and there's a great reference website not made by Microsoft that you can use, and I'll show you that in a future video. Okay, so at any rate, so the data source equals, and in this case it's easy, we just have to give it the name. Since it's local to our application, it should find it right there within the folder that'll contain our application. If we had it in some far off place, we'd have to take some additional steps to make sure that our application could find that file somewhere on the hard drive or network. So the first thing we're going to do is open up the connection. That says, okay, great, now that we have a connection, let's try to actually make this work and actually open it up the connection. The last thing we're going to want to do at the very bottom of our application is then close the connection. So in between is where we're going to do all of our work. Now if you remember what step 2, well in fact let's start here. Remember from our previous video that there were like 4 steps involved? So here we want to do a handshake with the database. The second step then would be what? Do you remember? To specify a command, or rather a request. And so here what we're going to do is create another object called a command object. So a SQL CE command, my command equals my connection dot create command. Then finally what we're going to do, let's start off with just, there's a couple of different ways that we can go about accessing the table of data that we have. Let's start with the first one, which is an easy one to conceptualize. We're just going to open up the customers table. And so we need 2 lines of code to do that. We're going to give it, first of all, what table we want, and then we need to tell it that we want to work with a table directly. We're not going to write T-SQL in this case. We're going to work directly with a table. So there is what's called an enumeration already created, system.data.command type. And you notice that, how did I get that so quickly? When I did this, notice that IntelliSense pops up. It knows that that command type method, it is of type system.data type data.command type. So it presented that for me automatically. And then I just hit the period on my keyboard in order for me to see the 3 options that were available to me. So in this case, we're going to go table direct. But look, we could send in text. We're going to do that in a minute. Or we could call a stored procedure if we wanted to use an Express Edition database. We're just going to go with, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to do table direct. We're going to go directly to the customers table. The next thing we're going to do is then create that that data reader. And a data reader is just the envelope that will contain all of the results from our request. You can think of this as like a self-addressed stamped envelope where you send an envelope addressed to yourself and you give it then to the database and you say, go ahead and fill this up. And it fills it up and it gives it back to you. And now you can work with it. So that data reader is like an envelope. So my data reader, whoops, let's define this thing. SQL CE data reader, my data reader equals, well, we won't do it equals just yet. What we will do is then my data reader equals my command dot execute reader. So now we're telling it, remember that command that we specified here? Go ahead and execute it and put the results in our envelope, this my data reader object. All right, so then for our purposes, step 3 is to actually use the data that's been returned to us. And so what we're going to do is just while my data reader can read another record out of the database, while there's still data left to read, then I want you to do this. Console.WriteLine, my data reader. And notice how I'm using like array syntax to access columns. It's similar syntax. Now there are some other ways we could go about doing this exact same thing. We're going to take this array, this element approach for now. Whoops. Plus my data reader 2, and we'll just leave it at that for now. And then the final thing we want to do, since this is a console application, is do a console.readLine. All right, so now let's save this. And now let's try to run it and see what happens. Hey, it worked. Look, it pulled column 1 and column 2. But you're saying, wasn't the first column a customer ID? That's right, but remember, we're zero based. So if I were to do this, let's do this. Let's see if it'll work. Let's change out the data that we're actually going to try and pull out of here. And I might even need to do a toString. In fact, just for safety's sake, let's toString it. Now, since we're going to grab the 0th element, let's run it. And you see I get the ID, the first name, and the last name. And I could extend this example to include city and state as well. All right, and so that's all there is to it. We have created the handshake, we specified a command, we executed the command, and then we worked with the data reader. Now, this entire time, and this is the important point, our connection to the database remained open. With the SQL Server Compact Edition database, that's not a problem because we're the only ones using that database. However, again, using SQL Server Express, a connected approach is sometimes not preferred. Now, in this case, we got our results and we closed up the connection immediately. But what if we wanted to do some calculations and manipulations all within this while statement? Then it might make more sense to close the connection, do our work, and then open up the connection and try to write back any results. That's a disconnected scenario. We'll talk about that in a couple videos from now. But that's it for this one. What we're going to do is do this exact same example, and we're going to see how it differs when we use a SQL Server Express Edition database. So we'll see you in the next video. Thank you.